Now, one of the most prominent and influential Indigenous leaders of the past half century in Australia has died. While it's not customary in many Aboriginal communities to name the deceased, the family of Yunupingu, an elder of the Yolngu people, has given permission for him to be identified. He was 70 years old and he dominated the fight for the rights of First Nations people. On the 12th of June 1988, Yunupingu presented the Barunga Statement to the then Prime Minister Bob Hawke. The statement called on the Australian government to recognise Aboriginal rights.
There's something to remind any government who will run in its power to change policies and constitutions that Aboriginal people will always be in front of their policy making and decision making, that we are people prior to this country, that the notice that we will present to the Prime Minister now will remind not only Bob Hawke, but the next one after him, and 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 we can count that for another 200 years.
The oratory there of Yunupingu. One of the people who worked with him was Denise Bowden, the CEO of Yothu Yindi Foundation.
He was a master of ceremonies, culturally the senior lawman of the Gumatj clan from northeast Arnhem Land. He's a keeper of Yolngu songlines, which culturally is a very significant senior position for any man to hold. His totems were rock, saltwater crocodile, and his name means the rock, the sacred rock that actually stands against time. Politically, he is remembered and respected and will long be remembered actually as a pioneer of the Australia's land rights movement.
Let's speak now to Joy Porter, Professor of Indigenous and Environmental History at the University of Hull here in the UK. Welcome to the programme. How would you characterise the contribution that this man made to the rights of Aboriginal people?
I think in two main ways. One is by the successive ways in which he tried to get a better deal for his own people, but also an abiding legacy that's left by him is the way he's changed forever Australian teaching and the Australian curriculum, because he brought in this idea of bilingual, bicultural education, what he called both ways education, and that's there forever. And then, of course, there's the enormous activism that starts, from 1963, when he helps draft the Yurrakala Bark petitions, and they assert customary law and native title over land.
Which are what? Explain that, because that was very significant.
Yes, it was. There's about 360 square kilometres of land, and the then Menzies government in Australia had granted a commercial bauxite mining lease without consulting the traditional Gumatj owners. And this, in the 60s, is when really the Australian Indigenous voice starts to really fight back in a structural sense against that great behemoth of mining, which has continued to be foundational to Australian economic life ever since.
He was also somebody who was able to move between these worlds. We heard from that speech that he made, completely fluent in English and a considerable orator.
Yes, he grows up initially with a kind of Bible education, but he was always open to the idea of Australia having two cultures coming together. He likened it to the waters in a lagoon where the sea's salty water meets the river's fresh water. And his vision was always for self-determination and for Aboriginal people to have a right to their land and to the use of their resources. And unfortunately, even though he made various attempts in the 80s in particular, and he's named Australian of the Year in 1978, and he's chair of the Northern Land Council that tries under the Hawke government to really try and get the first treaty going between Australia's Balanda people, as some Indigenous call the non-Indigenous, try and get a treaty and truth and voice in Parliament, all of those things going. He doesn't ultimately succeed, but he does succeed in creating a degree of self-determination for his own people. He starts a corporation. Again, mining's at the core of that.
You mentioned that he was Australian of the Year back in 1978. Would you say that the majority of white Australians would know who he is?
I think if you go on Twitter and you can see how the existing Prime Minister is speaking about great regret of this is a loss for all of Australia, and I think a lot of Australians knew who he was and knew about the things that he created and the abiding things like the festival he created of Aboriginal arts and so on. He's someone very important to what it means to anyone to be Australian. He gets the Order of Australia Medal in 1985. He's very culturally present.
Joy Porter, Professor of Indigenous and Environmental History at the University of Hull, remembering Yunupingu, a giant in activism for Aboriginal communities in Australia, who has died aged 70. You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Razia Iqbal. This is Newshour.